Druid in day 1. Pretty much everyone is going to play Summon Druid. It's one of the strongest starting builds in the game. So I'm just quickly going to go over how I do it. Gear-wise, I'm using Spirit Sword. I like the cast rate breakpoint because you have a lot of stuff to summon every game. So I'm trying to get 30. If I get a low roll Spirit, I would get another piece of FCR on a ring or a belt craft maybe. But the rest of the slots are pretty much dedicated to just getting your Fire and Light Res capped for Chaos runs and then Magic Find for the remainder. In this case I have a free Direwolf helm with some sockets for res. These could also be swapped. If you're not lucky with the helm, you could use a smoke chest for resistances and use some kind of triple topaz helm. It just depends on what you get. If you get a smoke base or not, or if you have a 4-socket Dusk Shroud or not. For shield here I'm using Rhyme, which is a luxury you probably won't have initially because you're going to need more resistance from a shield. So you're most likely going to be using Ancient's Pledge or 3 Diamond Shield. As for the skill setup and mercenary setup, it probably differs a bit from the classic build. The classic build is max Raven because it carries you on normal difficulty, and with the Raven build typically you're using a Vigor Rogue initially just to buff your move speed, and because a melee mercenary is a bit difficult to keep alive, but here I'm chosen to go with a merc that can deal damage, so I like to build a bit differently. I keep Raven at 1 point, I get 1 point Vines, and I max Heart of Wolverine to buff your mercenary damage instead of maxing Raven as the last summon synergy. Of course you're going to want 1 point Gust, and at this point it depends how your build is and what your gear status is. I like to dump more points in Gust just to lower the cooldown, but if you somehow already have a Nash staff or you find yourself not using teleport that often because you're playing hardcore, you might not need the Gust that badly. But I would recommend tail stomping a lot with this build to increase your efficiency. And again, on this build I'd want a Nash staff offhand as soon as possible, but initially you're just going to get a teleport charges staff, which you could shop at Hill or Nightmare Carol with a Cowport or Dual Arena next to her. As long as you have a filter, it'll only take a couple of minutes. Back to the mercenary, I'm using a BO/Vulcan mercenary here. You need to kit him out fairly well for him to survive in Chaos. I have the mercenary guide linked in the corner and the description to go over it, but in this build I want to use a Lionheart as chests as soon as possible to buff his damage. But initially you might need safety craft on both of these slots to get enough damage reduction for him to survive in CS. And this build you can already farm Chaos very comfortably as long as you have the res where they need to be. Since you don't have Ravens to deal with physical immunes, you're relying on your mercenary to proc Battle Cry to lower the fizz res. If you dislike playing summon builds, here's a quick transition you can make pretty early on into Twister and Tornado Druid. This is what I consider the minimum equipment to do that on hardcore for it to be worthwhile over summons. A quick note before I go into the build is this helm, Unique Hawk Helm, is really good at the beginning. Whether you're playing Summon or Elemental Druid, just the Gust cooldown is really nice to have on either build. Now as for the gear for Elemental Druid, there's a few things you want to accomplish. You want to hit the 68 FCR breakpoint. You obviously need good resistances on hardcore to do chaos runs, which is the goal of this build. I have way more cold res than I need. You don't need that much cold res to do chaos runs, but you want to have cap fire res and very close to cap light res at least. As for the rest of gear, you also kind of really want to have block on this build, which is why I'm using Rhyme. Not only for the block, but also for Canopy Frozen, and as well as a bit of MF. Aside from that, you really want some plus skills to get the damage where it needs to be. One way to get there early is a free Twister Helm in this case. I socketed it with a large quest to get 3 sockets for Topaz to get my Magic Find, because it's hard to get Magic Find in this setup early on otherwise. I'm using a smoke chest to cover the res angle. Because this is made on beta, I don't have the 3 elemental amulet, but I would need a 3 elemental skills amulet. I'm using 3 charms to simulate that instead. For gloves I'm using Tranks. Again, 68 breakpoint is not that easy to get. Here I'm using the Spirit, 20 from the gloves, and I have a Castercraft which I managed to get 20 on, which is not super difficult. But combining these and 1 or 2 castrate rings, you should be able to manage 68 without requiring any on the armor or the shield slot. If you're lucky early, you could use something like a Spirit Shroud perhaps. It covers the castrate as well as gives you Canopy Frozen, but it lacks in both Magic Find and Res, but you could build differently. Like if you had a Spirit Shroud, maybe you could use a Moses for good resistances. But ideally for this build, on hardcore, I would really want a Horizon's Tornado before respeccing out of summons. Like the damage boost is just huge with this weapon. Now one other important thing before you can really do this build in hardcore is you need to have a Merc that is decently set up. So you need a couple of good safety crafts. In this case I have 10% PDR on both and a high defense on the chest. And you want a really good weapon. The 2 most obvious choices, well, the most obvious choice is Reaper's Toll, Act 2 Defiance Mercenary, which is what you really want. But you might not be able to get that this early, so one thing you could do is use Neotherial Lawbringer 2-hander. The damage is okay, but the main thing here is the Decrypify on striking. Helps keep your Merc alive, boosts your damage a little bit. Another choice could be Unique Tusk Sword, Vile Husk for Amplify damage. You would probably want to upgrade this, which is a bit costly early on, but just to get the mercenary damage up to help him survive with the leech. The remaining slots is to try and get attack speed. In this case I'm using Zygon's combo, just to help the proc go faster. But with this build, you have +7 Twister or so. Let me get the points. The damage is already going to be very decent for CS runs. Going to 1 point Vines, 1 point Grizzly for tanking, 1 point Oak. And then it depends a bit. Again, I'd want a Nash staff here. I think this build is heavily dependent on mobility, so without a Nash staff I wouldn't play it. I would be playing Summon until I had it, along with the other things. But you could go Gust here to lower the cooldown. Like if you pair that with the Helm, your Gust cooldown is suddenly not looking too bad. But let's say you don't have the Gust reduction Helm. You could dump more points into Oak Sage, because again, you're not going to have a whole lot of life. Like this build, I'm playing block. I don't have that much block. I actually should have put more points in Dex here. I would get at least 50 to 60% block with Rhyme. So if you're using the BO Merc, which I still am in this case, you would have decent life pool, but if you're using the Defiance Merc, you would probably have less than 1000 life. Unless you already farmed a pretty decent inventory of Charms of Life. But let's take this guy to CS and show you how capable it is. One quick thing I didn't go over is if you plan to stay on this build for a while, one potential early upgrade could be the combo from this set, Ondals and Tabex Glory. The shield grants block, cast rate, good defense. The helm grants 2+ skills, but when combined you also get even more cast rate out of these. The only issue with this setup is the massive strength requirement, as well as the shield not providing any res, but you can sort that out with other slots potentially. Now getting started on maps early on, you could obviously keep playing Summoner and begin maps as early as level 80 really. It's just going to be very slow in the beginning and you have to be cautious. Another approach to getting into maps relatively early is going for Fire Druid. In this case Volcano Armageddon, which is definitely the strongest fire spec and arguably the strongest elemental druid spec in the game right now. Just a quick look at the gear I'm using. You might not need a full set of skillers, but elemental skillers are pretty easy to trade for, so you can just kind of full set probably of plane skillers pretty quickly. You'd want a torch. I am an Annie in this case, you obviously don't need an Annie. You probably don't need a torch, but it's pretty nice to have because you don't have that much life, etc. For the remaining gear, the goal is to hit 99 cast rate. For that I'm using Earthshaker as a weapon. This is just a mana per kill slam, 1 socket, 4 elemental skill, 20 cast rate. Using Mage Gloves, FCR. I'm using V Magi, FCR. That puts you at 70 cast rate. Then there's another 30 to go. I'm using 120 cast rate ring, and then it's just 10% to go. You can get this on the other ring slot, or one of these slots with a corruption, or a crafted amulet perhaps. In this case I have a rare amulet with 10 cast rate. I'm using Verdungos for damage reduction. This is a hardcore guide after all. Storm Shield, same story. Damage reduction, block res. Water Walk for stats mainly. And finally Ravenlore as a helm, which is really strong. In this case I have a Topaz Socketed just to try and get some Magic Find. As you can see I have 117 Magic Find, which is decent. But I also socketed 2 Topazes and Ists for that, and a Geats obviously. It's a bit tough to squeeze in Magic Find early, but you can do it with Magic Find Charms and Topaz Sockets, as you can see. Another choice is to use a rack to make the FCR breakpoint a bit easier to reach. It's definitely viable, but I like to Tailor Stomp with this build, so I prefer Verdungos. You could definitely play a rack and play a bit safer, depending on the maps you like to run. Another chest choice could be Q-Hagens or Atmos Veil. They're both decent. In the case of Q-Hagens you have less cast rate, which you need to find elsewhere, but you have an additional plus skill and you have mana per kill. You also don't have rest though, which I think is the main factor that I'm not using it. And Atmos is the same story, no rest, so I will stick to Skin of the Viper Magi this early. For the maps, well, let me go over the Mercenary. I'm just using Defiance Mercenary with the Reaper's Toll here. The amplified damage helps your Volcano damage a bit. Otherwise it's just a standard damage reduction setup with Delirium Helm for crowd control. You could use a Flickering Flame Rune Lord here if you can afford it, but I think the damage boost is pretty minor and the crowd control from Delirium is more helpful. As for the skills, Max Armageddon, Max Volcano and Max the Synergies. Fissure, Molten Boulder, 1 point Gust, 1 point in Vines, 1 point in Grizzly to tank nasty stuff. Not quite remaining points in Oak Sage. I've put some points in Gust to lower the cooldown a bit, but otherwise the rest of the points went into Oak Sage. With the setup you can definitely comfortably do the common fire tier 1 maps like Torrent Jungle, Ruined System, and tier 2s like Vistune and Royal Crypts. And now for the endgame version of the Fire Druid, which I think is the fastest Druid mapper in this version, if you play it properly. Gear is going to look pretty similar to the last one, just better slams, etc. In this case I upgraded to 4-socket Earth Shaker with facets, well, 2 facets and 2 life after each kill jewels. Mage Fist with faster block, still using a Raven Frost because I don't have a CBF slime. Dongos still, Castrate Ring with life after each kill, still Water Walk. Storm Shield, Mars with FCR, Ravenlore, +1, facets. I changed the chest to Atmos Veil for a bit of magic find and hit recovery, because my wrist situation is relatively decent. Could be better, but it's alright. Obviously still the same inventory. Well, this is a good inventory, it was on the last druid as well, but the last druid was not meant to be really an endgame showcase. Merc has an Infinity now, still using Delirium for crowd control. Let's see how this beast performs in maps. Now as for the second choice for in-game solo mapping, I've decided to go with Fury Druid. Rabies got nerfed again. I think it's still a very strong build. Once you have enough facets, good enough corruptions in the gear, and if you stay away from maximum life slam tier 3s. But since the build has been so popular for a couple of seasons and it's pretty straightforward in how you build it, I decided not to include it here. And for the other Elemental Druid, which is Twister and Wind, I think it's very strong in endgame maps as well, but it's less viable on hardcore because you don't have room to kite dangerous ranged packs, so it's a bit more problematic to play on hardcore. Now for Fury, I was surprised at how strong of a build it is. If you have a decent weapon, well, decent gear overall, it got a bit of a nerf, but I think it's still a very decent mapper if you can get a really good weapon. When it comes to mapping, I think nothing beats the Tomb Reaver. This character is made in the beta, so I don't have access to corruptions, which means I don't have the greatest edition of this weapon, but this is already quite decent. But this is about the kind of weapon you'd really want to be playing maps with a Fury Druid, if you ask me. For the remaining slots, I'm using Cerebus Bite for Deadly Strike mainly. Leviathan for damage reduction. Again, this is a guide for hardcore, and Fury Druid with 200 is pretty low in defensive stats. I'm using High Lords for Deadly Strike, War Traps for damage, but mainly Magic Find, which this build doesn't really have apart from Geats, War Traps, and Slams potentially. Using BK Ring for damage reduction. I would probably use 2 BK Rings here, with a Cham Socket or a CBF Slam here instead, just to overstack my damage reduction against amplified damage. I'm using String for damage reduction as well. And for the gloves, I'm using Laying of Hands here, because the build I have is a bit low on res. You could obviously use Steel Rend or Grave Palm for even more Deadly Strike. It just depends on what slams you have available and how to piece things together. For the inventory, it's a bit of a mixture. It's mainly max damage charms with life, a couple of res charms, and 1 shapeshifting with life. Note with this build, with the nerf, which is fairly minor, my life pool is not that high, but if you had like full shapeshift skillers with life, which is typically what you mostly use for bosses, you would have a lot more life. But this build is perfectly viable. You can do tier 3s, but I think the main one is sewers. You could potentially do thrones, but it's a bit more sketchy since this build does not have enhanced defense apart from the mercenaries, so it is a bit squishy sometimes. Skills, it's quite obvious. Fury, Feral Rage has Fury Synergy, Max Lycanthropy for HP, Max Werewolf, Max Heart of Wolverine, 1 point Grizzly that I can cast when I run into dangerous range packs. One thing to note here is it's a melee build without great AoE, so you probably want to run fortified maps. I'm not a big fan of fortified maps, but this is probably one of the builds where you want to run fortified maps.